I'll be reading from selections from Matthew 16, John 11, and John 12. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me will find it. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethesda, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "The sickness will not end in death. No, this is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. On his arrival, Jesus found Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died." After she said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? I tell you the truth. Unless a kernel of seed fall into the ground and die, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. The man who loves his life will lose it, while the man who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life."
When Ivana and I lived in Russia, I had a habit, not quite, but probably mostly every Sunday morning, of getting up at about 6 o'clock to write a sermon. That was self-protection in the event that at the end of the meeting in the brothers' room, I would hear, "Dan, you have the 3rd sermon today." Well, the expectations were a little different in that congregation than they are here. And if you were in their services, you weren't always sure if they could tell the difference between time and eternity. So if you get done listening before I get done talking this morning, would the last person out the door blink the lights? There are 2 themes that I see as merging. On one hand is the theme of the response of grief following loss. And on the other hand is the reflex and the paradox of control and letting go. Last Sunday, John gave us a very helpful spiritual frame for dealing with loss with a beautiful description of the kintsugi art form. This morning, at John's suggestion, I'm focusing on what perhaps is a more mundane way, or a more clinical way perhaps, of looking at loss and grieving. Namely, how do we do the work of grieving following a loss? Now, it's been uncanny for me personally that in this past week or so, while I've been working at trying to put this sermon together, there have been several people close to me who have lost loved ones to death. It made it real to me just how difficult and challenging it can be to live through a passage of grief. It's very nuanced and highly unique to each person who experiences it. Indeed, there are no pat answers or formulas for how to walk through grief. There's no standard of how one should manage the experience. And I do hope that the ideas I share this morning might contribute to your own thinking, stir up that thinking, and perhaps provide some perspective for experiences in which perspective is often hard to come by. Now, I assume that song by Paul McCartney is familiar to everyone. Let me tell you, it's a little disconcerting to have the cutting-edge music of my youth now be sort of elevator music, but we'll let that be. The reference in the song is readily to Mother Mary is readily assumed to be a reference to Mary, the mother of Jesus. McCartney has said that it's okay with him if people make that assumption, but that it was actually a reference to his own mother, who was named Mary and who had died some years earlier. The inspiration for the song was a dream McCartney had during a particularly troubled period of his life. And in the dream, his mother appeared to him, encouraging him to let it be. Just accept it. Go with it. And he apparently found those words to be comforting and encouraging. Let it be instead of fighting it. Let yourself experience, move into that reality. Now, I think that we have the potential of taking that advice, let it be, in a convoluted and opposite way. Sort of like, let it be, let it alone, don't go there, avoid that, or at least pretend to avoid it. This begins to point to the paradox of being in control and letting go. I know how to make that work. That's great. The more important something is perceived to be, the more valiantly we strive to control that thing or that experience. And then what follows can so often be seen paradoxically. That is, the more intensely we struggle to maintain that control, the more elusive and remote our hoped-for outcomes might actually become. So I offer it as a paradox. The more we drive for control, the more control can vanish. Sort of like a sneeze that disappears the moment you try to make it happen. There are seemingly endless paradoxes you might think of at work in our normal lives, and here are just a few. The parents who so want their child to be excellent, to be superior, to be perfect, that they hover or helicopter and inhibit the child's own development, and the child fails to develop the capacity to find their own strengths and chart their own course. Or a lover whose anxiety about being left by the object of the love, the person they feel so strongly pulled to, become controlling, trying to control that person, only to have the love fade and that controlling behavior drive the lover away. Or the business owner who is determined to control her enterprise to the ultimate of success, so much so that she stifles the initiative and creativity of the people necessary to do the work for that success, with the effect of anemic results or even failure. Or the individual who has this strong internal reflex that says, to be seen as a respected and mature person, I must control any and all emotions. Nothing bothers me, with the effect of being internally racked by those emotions and isolated from the support of others. To me, each of these examples has embedded in it an element of loss, a threat of loss, a loss of control, the fear of loss of control. And in each, the strong and automatic urge and effort to retain control can lead to the very loss that was feared. You see, I'm convinced that something there is in the human spirit which hates the experience of being out of control, or at least the perception of being out of control. And I think this paradox of control is central to understanding and finding a way to live effectively with our grief responses following loss. Now, when we think of loss and start talking about it, it's sort of natural to think about the loss through death. And that the death of a loved one may well be the most intense experience of loss, but we certainly encounter many other losses along the way, each of which can challenge us with this same paradox of control and letting go. The loss of physical health when we're confronted with a significant illness and the diagnosis of it. The loss of a business opportunity. The loss of strength and ability as the byproduct of accumulated years. That's called aging. The loss of a hoped-for experience. And that certainly is one way to describe a wide swath of loss that has accompanied this pandemic over the last year and a half. We can go on and on. The loss of being involved when I was accustomed to being right in the middle of things and no longer am. The loss of routines, boring as they might be, but at least they were predictable. The loss of having influence, maybe through retirement. Recognizing that loss is a part of these normal life events and being able to identify the element of grief that naturally accompanies those losses can be an important contributor to finding our way with hope and healing. So what might it look like, this reflective action to maintain the appearance or sense of control when grief is strong? Just pay attention to some of the language used in relation to someone who's grieving. The use of terms that seem to value and praise the avoidance of emotion. He or she was so strong. They handled that with class. Their faith was so inspiring. Such a testimony. Praising non-emotion. Or conversely, we use expressions that subtly or even more openly suggest that the experience of strong emotion is some sort of failure. Not strong, but a failure to meet what's expected. He broke down. She's not handling it well at all. Then, too, there are the ways we seek to manage our own emotions. We do sometimes our best to conceal our emotions, put that smile in the front of it all. Apologizing for our tears. Avoiding conversations about difficult events. Talking with a confidence that we may not feel that something good will certainly come out of this sad and difficult experience. Using platitudes and euphemisms that deflect and cover our real experience. Spiritualizing our strong emotions away. Diminishing the emotional experience of loss and the real intensity of the grief by deflecting it, maybe even by pointing to heaven by and by, rather than being willing to be in the moment and to experience the messiness of the emotions, the distress of dealing with an event that is so out of our control. Again, the paradox. This list illustrates our tendency toward maintaining the appearance of control, to avoid the messiness of emotions, to have things be as we would like them to be, to have them be more comfortable, to avoid the feeling of being out of control. And I'd like you to handle your emotions so I can be comfortable too, you notice? The more we reflexively seek to gain or regain control, the more elusive it can become. You see, Jesus had comments that seemed to me to speak to the same paradox. And I think you'll really recognize this. Maybe this was Jesus' version of let it be. You need to lose your life to save it. Except a seed fall in the ground and die, it'll only be a little seed. If it dies, it'll reproduce plentifully. The first shall be last. The last shall be first. The least among you will be the greatest. Paradox. It's in letting go control that we might realistically gain or have a sense of certainty. In his book, Falling Upward, Richard Rohr explores this paradox quite a bit. A few things from that book. Quote, there always will be at least one situation in our lives that we cannot control, explain, change, or even understand. Rohr quotes a Spanish philosopher. Life is not, nor has ever been, a straight line forward, but is characterized much more by exception and disorder than by total or perfect order. The biblical tradition makes it clear that life is both loss and renewal, death and resurrection, chaos and healing at the same time, a collision of opposites. Well, it seems to me that if we can begin to dare to try to get clear about this kind of reality, that it provides a base from which we can live with this paradox. Rohr goes on to say, what looks like falling can largely be experienced as falling upward and onward into a broader and deeper world. And to quote Rohr again, the only consistent pattern I can find is that all the books of the Bible seem to agree that somehow God is with us and we are not alone. I find that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief describe a natural progression through this experience of grief. Now, these stages are never experienced in any sort of neat and tidy sequence that moves cleanly from one stage to the next, but are more likely to be experienced as a somewhat challenging and confusing swirl. But as you look at them, you can see that the stages describe a movement toward, once again, reestablishing a more comfortable sense of control and toward healing. Just a quick rundown of the stages. Whoops, I'm way behind there. Sorry. First, denial. It can't be real. This serves as a sort of shock absorber to move into the experience without an emotional short circuit. That's followed by a stage of anger. Rational anger or irrational anger. Anger is a sense of mobilization to deal with the threat of the loss. Then there's a stage of bargaining, a rumination on different narratives or explanations of what could have, should have, would have been that might have changed the course of events and spared us the loss, which has taken away our sense of control. And it might be rational or irrational, but it's an effort to have a way of making sense of what happened. And then there's a stage of self-loathing or depression, perhaps, a generalizing, a spreading of the sadness and futility to all of life, not just to the particular loss at hand, which is followed by, I think, a time of sadness. It's as though having walked through all of these processes, a person might now be fully free to move into the real sadness of what they have been experiencing, which leads then to an open-ended stage of healing, not defined by a certain period of time, nor by disappearance of the sadness which surrounds the loss, but a gradual recognition that more normal life energy and interests are returning and healing is happening. All my life, the headline and the entire focus for the story of Lazarus was about Jesus bringing Lazarus back from the dead. Well, stages of grief was probably not a framework that was available to the writers of the gospel. So I may be stretching it a bit to see in this passage that you heard read earlier some indication of people experiencing this process of moving through grief. The stage of denial in verses 4 and 5 of John 11, Jesus said, "This won't end in death." Then he stayed where he was for 2 days when he knew his friend was sick, and it was only 2 miles away. Was Jesus in denial? He also said Lazarus has fallen asleep. Well, maybe not, but if you look at verse 12, it seems the disciples were. They thought he really meant natural sleep, and he had to straighten them out on that. In verse 20, when Jesus arrived in Bethany and Mary, she didn't go out to meet Jesus. Was she avoiding? I'll just stay here in the house and do my thing, and I don't have to deal with the mess of my pain and my sadness. So denial may be showing there. A stage of anger. In verse 21, Martha dashed out to confront Jesus. "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." It's not hard to see that it was an angry edge to her expression. Then the bargaining, the ruminating of trying to make sense of it. Mary finally comes out to meet Jesus, and she uses the same words. Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But it was a bit different for Martha, because when Mary said that, she fell on the ground at Jesus' feet. Less suggestive of her being angry, but it might be more of her trying to have a verbiage, a way of describing it that made sense to her, that she could hold it together. And then in verse 37, some of those standing by said, if he was able to open the eyes of a man blind, couldn't he have saved Lazarus? If this, then that. Searching for an explanation, a box to put the experience into that makes sense, that gives you a sense of control, even if it's an uneven control. Then I think there's a stage of sadness that's really apparent. Verses 33 to 35 say, there was weeping. It seems that the community who was gathered here was free to join together and weep openly with each other. And that included Jesus. Free to let the expression of sadness flow without any mask. And Jesus wept. What catches my attention is the description of Jesus and this community going directly toward the sadness. They went to the tomb in spite of the comment that it would be quite unpleasant. It'd smell bad. They did not avoid any of that unpleasant. And then there's that direct comment that they wept. It suggests that rather than trying to maintain the appearance of control by avoiding the emotion of loss, Jesus joined these people assembled there in drinking the cup of sadness completely. As far as the stage of healing, there's no record that I'm aware of in the gospel, but I would believe that this willingness to move fully into the reality and the emotions of the loss of Lazarus contributed to the positive adjustment of those dealing with grief. Two quick stories. A lot of years ago, in the professional office where I had my practice that time, there was an office manager. Now, this was a woman that was able to take charge. She was quiet and focused and competent and could make anything happen. Very effective woman. It so happened that one evening she and her husband took their 4-year-old daughter and went to visit the construction site of the home they were having built. And tragically, the child fell through a hole in the decking and died from her injuries. I went to that viewing, and there sat this mother, this competent, focused, in-control mother, totally absorbed by her grief. There was no smile on her face. I could see her sitting there incoherent, rocking. I don't even think she knew who was coming by. There was no comments about hope or we'll get something good out of this. She was totally, completely absorbed in her grief. In a very short time, maybe 2, maybe 3 weeks, I don't remember how long, she returned to the office. She was focused, she was functional, she was effective, and she could talk about her death of her daughter openly. Now, I didn't do an evaluation of her, but it struck me, and has stayed with me ever since, that the ability of her to fully, without restraint, experience the cup of sadness was material to her being able to regenerate and come back together effectively. The other short story is one that involves my father. He was not a man of a lot of words, and certainly not one that would express a lot of emotions. This had to do with after the death of his mother, my grandmother, who died at age 94. So it was a very unusual conversation for me to say one day, "Pop, how you doing with Grandma's death?" And he said, "Well, I suppose that eventually one gets over it." And a light bulb went off in my head. And I didn't say this to Pop, but I said to myself, no, you don't get over it. You experience it. And that has been important to me ever since. I'd like to share a couple of guidelines. These are not behavioral prescriptions, but rather concepts that may point the way, and if you want to do anything with them, you'd have to decide what behavior you would do. First, decide that you will heal. To the degree you're able, make a deliberate choice that you will work toward healing. even though you may have no idea what that means at the moment. 2, dedicate time to your healing. The more significant loss, the greater the impact, the more important it is to purposefully invest time to work toward healing. You won't necessarily know what to do with that time, but if you persist, it will likely become clear how that time will become important to you. You may want to reserve time to weep or time for just being quiet with yourself. 3, assess your best soothing and calming resources. Use the things that you know are good for you. Those things that when you do them, they have that positive benefit. Perhaps it's sitting on the back deck watching the birds, or walking or exercise of some other sort, being in a place and space that you're likely to experience as soothing and rejuvenating. 4, nourish your soul. Engage with those processes and activities which focus on your values and which have given your life meaning in the past. Prayer, scripture, music. Some of these things will be things you take in, and some will be expressive. Music you play, or songs you sing, writing you do, painting, or other skills that are soothing expressions for you. 5, cultivate at least one empathetic connection. Did that move? Oh, there we go. Cultivate at least one empathetic connection. I specify an empathetic connection as compared to a sympathetic connection. A person who is sympathetic may respond more out of their own sympathetic reflexes, their own pain, or their own discomfort with your pain, or their own urge to make things better for you. While an empathetic connection is a person who will know what your experience is because they have the capacity to listen to it as you tell them. Plan for regularly connecting with such a person, not just when you think you might need it, but regularly. 6, respect your privacy for this work. You're under no obligation to share any of this journey with anyone, nor are you under any obligation to show the world how strong you are, nor how well you're coping. So choose your contacts, but remember, this is no time to isolate. Hang on to some affirmations. You may have been affected by the strength of what you experienced, have lost your confidence of your standing as a valued and respected member of your community. It may be really uncomfortable to be on the receiving end of care rather than on the giving end. Well, as you're receiving that, assert to yourself, whether you feel it or not, that I am not a victim. You may have been laid low, but you're not a victim, and you're not disqualified. Now, frankly, this one may mean you have to fake it till you make it. And the last one is notice the progression. Some people find journaling to be very helpful, and others of us find it just plain tedious. But find your way to notice that things are changing and notice what you're experiencing. That goes without saying that this is not helpful if you apply a should to this. I should be progressing. I should be experiencing this or that. Pay attention to what is, including when it seems that things are getting lighter and when things may seem like they're getting darker. The objective is not to wipe out all sadness, but rather to be aware of what healing looks like for you. If you pay attention, you're likely to notice that the emotions that come as you reflect on the loss over time are gradually going to become the emotions of memory, as distinguishable from the emotions in the actual experience. But don't put this on a timetable. Let it happen at a pace as yours. Yes, the path of healing our grief is through the sadness, not around it, by opening ourselves fully and with hope to the full emotion. To the degree we're able to do this, we'll likely discover that pain and joy are not separate, but are actually integrated, intertwined. And perhaps it's at the point of gratitude. Gratitude for the gift of having loved the one who is gone. That gratitude may be the point that allows us to receive the blend of sadness and joy. So in your hour of darkness, drink the cup of sadness all the way to the bottom. It's too important to miss any of it. The sadness and grief is in direct and equal proportion to the significance of the loss. If you lose something or someone of great value, there would be something wrong in not feeling a fully proportionate sense of grief and loss. So drink the cup of sadness all the way to the bottom, in honor of the one whom you have lost, to free yourself to feel gratitude, and to help you along the path of your own healing. So let it be.